Hello? Okay. So guys, it's after 5. I'm sure people will trickle in, but we really need to get started. We have many nice lectures and an exciting lineup of speakers. So this session will present Agro-Informatics, okay, with different applications of Agro-Informatics. And we had one cancellation, Oded Liran could not attend. We're remaining with 5 lectures, okay? The first one will be by Gerrit Hoogenboom from University of Florida. He's our guest speaker about crop modeling and data standards. Then we have Tarin, who will speak about the yield prediction, almond. Tal Svoray from Ben Gurion will talk about soil health mapping. Aviva Peeters will talk about the geostatistics and within field variation, right, of management zones. And last but not least, I will be speaking about data standards and how they can stimulate data sharing and, in the end, drive new innovation. So the idea is to bring several aspects of agro-informatics. It's a huge field. But let's start with this, okay? So please, Gerrit. Gerrit Hoogenboom from Florida.
So I appreciate the invitation to talk to you today about crop modeling and also talk a little bit about data and data standards. So I want to talk a little bit about crop modeling and introduce you to the concept of crop modeling. So I assume all of you agree that agriculture is a very risky business, deals with a lot of uncertainty. And for most of us probably were in the room, we are paid by a state organization and a university. But for farmers, really, they rely on their agricultural crop, and most of it is driven by weather variability, especially uncertainty of weather, climate variability. They have to deal with economics, prices are unknown, and then also, last but not least, policies set by our governments. So that's all quite challenging. Now, I realize that agro-informatics and modeling and decision support systems cannot solve all these problems, but what I would like to introduce to you is the question, could computer models at least help us address some of these risk questions where we look at the interaction between genetics, crop management, and environment? And then also, can we use these crop models to do predictions? So traditionally, when we look at agriculture, and I've even seen some of these presentations during this meeting as well, we conduct field experiments, replicated field experiments. We conduct this for 2 or 3 years. We publish the results, and at least in the United States, then we take the results, take them to extension, and then hopefully these will be implemented by farmers. But as we all know, at least in the US, maybe here your climate is a little bit differently, we depend a lot again on the weather we have during those 2 or 3 years. Could be dry years, could be wet years. So there's still a lot of uncertainty associated with these economic practices and recommendations that come out of traditional agricultural research. So what I really then want to propose, and I'm sure all of you agree with that because you're in the same session, is really a more systems-based approach where we combine the experimental data with computer models. So ultimately what we're interested in is first of all understand the system. That's why we're trying to do research in general. But especially if we're trying to do research in agriculture, we also want to be able to predict the system. And ultimately, again, when we're trying to provide recommendations to farmers, we want to be able to control and management. So the idea is not that these models and predictive systems can provide us with the exact answer. Really, we want to provide the stakeholders of farmers with different options for agricultural management, look at risk reduction. So really then what we're looking at here is model development. And in this case, model is more in generic context. It could be a statistical model, could be a dynamic crop simulation model, could also be AI, which is becoming very dominant in this field as well. Then we can develop a model, whatever it is. We can do prediction, we can evaluate a prediction with additional data and hopefully improve our model. And at the same time, we can also use these same models then for the decision support. So ultimately, again, what we're trying to interested in is provide advisories to farmers through decision support systems, where we're again trying to integrate the knowledge we have from the different disciplines to understand these different management practices and ultimately what we call provide actionable information. So I've been associated with a crop modeling system called DSAT, the Decision Support System for Agro-Technology Transfer, which we now really refer to as a crop modeling ecosystem. It originated in the 1980s through a grant funded by USAID, Agency of International Development, to look at food security in developing countries using computer models. Honestly, this project was way ahead of its time because at that time there were not many computers in developing countries. But still continue to exist today. It's one of the most widely used crop modeling systems across the globe with thousands of users. So we really have what we call an ecosystem of crop model users. We also have an ecosystem of people who actually can train on these models. We've trained them as well across the globe, and we have a system of crop model developers as well. And we have currently at least models for 40 different crops, most of these looking at food systems, feed systems, and fiber systems. We don't really have too many crops yet, or non-crops and fruit systems, so that's still a challenge. We have tools, utilities for data preparation, and then we also have developed a minimum data standard actually to define what the inputs would be for these crop simulation models. We'll get to that in a minute. And we've also developed the CASA data standards as well, trying to develop the crop modeling community to see if people are interested to have a common standard, which again is a challenge. So this is the shell of the system, and again, I don't have time to go into detail. It accesses a whole range of models underneath it. It has various tools to access the data and application programs, etc. So when we look at these crop system, in this case, I'm looking more at the dynamic crop simulation models. It requires data as input. So we're looking at daily weather data, we're looking at soil data, looking at crop management data. We also need some information on genetics. Most of these models operate on what we call a daily time step. So we start the simulations at planting. We go all the way to harvest, predict harvest maturity. So we predict phenology in these systems, flowering date, maturity date, and in parallel then we predict photosynthesis, respiration, partitioning, ultimately resulting in plant growth. So then we get to yield, but it's not really also about yield. Again, when we talk about farming systems, a farmer is more interested in economics. What is his net return on his annual production system? So it brings in the cost of production with respect to the inputs as well as the prices he obtains for his products. For these models, we can also look at environmental impact, do a soil water balance, soil nitrogen balance, and we've got nitrogen leaching. We can also look at resource use, how much water would be required to grow a particular crop for a particular environment. So again, so if we look at the implementation of these models, again, they require data as inputs. We do require that these models need to be calibrated a little bit. We have a lot of genetics in these models, and we are unable to define local cultivar characteristics for all the crops across the globe. So people, when they like to applying for the local conditions, they need to calibrate these local cultivar coefficients. And we also highly recommend that people evaluate these models as well with an independent data set to make sure that they really operate. And then they can use for what we call on the computer, develop what if type experiments, look at different scenarios, look at different weather conditions, look at climate change, etc. And ultimately, again, provide actionable information for climate smart agriculture, which has now become the new buzzword, at least in the agricultural system. And again, with these models, we can look at a whole range of applications. As I said, in the early days of looking at food security, currently they're being used a lot for climate change applications, climate variability applications, biofuels. We look at land use change analysis, risk insurance, carbon sequestration, carbon markets even. So lots of opportunities where these models can be applied. But again, data plays a key role in these crop models. We require data as inputs, and we really need to show that these models are credible. So we need to have some observational data available associated with these models for evaluation. So here's an example of what a detailed evaluation would look like. Some of you might be familiar with these time series data where we have time on the x-axis, in this case day of year. We have biomass on the y-axis. So the continuous line here demonstrates what we can simulate for a soybean production system. This happens to be an experiment conducted quite a while ago at the University of Florida on the rain-fed conditions and irrigated conditions. So we have two lines for biomass, rain-fed, irrigated, and we have two for above-ground yield. rain-fed and irrigated. And the points correspond to observed data points. In this case, we have very detailed observations where we compare simulated with the observed data. So here the model does do a fairly good job, partially because the coefficients have been calibrated. But again, this is one of our more robust models looking at the soybean system. So then let's get back to the data parts. As already said, we need the experimental data as input. We need a little bit about genetics, which is one of the most challenging parts when we run these crop simulation models. We need to have the weather data, we have soil data, and then we also, within the model, we create a whole set of output data associated with these simulations. So one of the challenges we face when we talk to our users, especially those who are not very familiar with crop simulation models in general, they always fuss that we require too much data to run these simulation models. So we try to come up with a definition of what we call a minimum data set. So we define it here as a data set that can provide us reasonable answers to conduct our simulations, but at the same time also can be quite easily collected under field conditions. Maybe not necessarily farmer's field, but at least in experimental field. So this is one of the challenges we face. Especially then when you bring in other modelers, they might define another minimum data set. So even within the crop modeling community, you really have never come to an agreement what is a true minimum data set. And a lot of it also depends on what you're actually trying to simulate with respect to your agricultural system. And again, the concept of minimum data set didn't start today. What you see here actually is a picture of a symposium that was conducted in 1982 at ICRISAT in India, one of the international research centers, but already we're discussing this minimum data concept. And as of today, we're still struggling with this whole minimum data concept as well. So with respect to these crop simulation models, this is what we like to break it down to. Again, first of all, weather is very important. So hopefully we all agree that daily maximum minimum temperature, precipitation, and solar radiation are key to having a minimum data set. The second part, because we're simulating a soil water balance, we need to know something about the soil conditions. So we need to know soil profile information, by horizon, probably looking at the water holding characteristics, soil texture, bulk density. Need to know a little bit about the soil surface because we're looking at evaporation, we're looking at runoff and drainage, etc. So we require that as input. And this is where some cases we see a lot of challenges. Again, we're trying to predict yield, we're trying to understand yield, but then we need to know what the accurate inputs were. So most people know when they planted a crop, they don't always forgot or know or remembered, what the plant spacing was. And we start looking at inputs, it becomes even more challenging. People might say, I applied 100 millimeters of irrigation at the end of the experiments, but are unable to provide you with the dates and the amounts of the irrigation application. So it makes it very challenging to look at an accurate simulation. Same for fertilizer. People might say, I applied 150 kgs of nitrogen, but not necessarily the dates and the amounts of nitrogen. So all of these inputs become quite a challenge. But again, this is how we define a minimum data set. The next part, we start looking at the observations. So we define level 1 as the data sets that are required to run a model, but we also need to have some observations to compare our simulations with the observed data. Again, when we're talking about a crop model, yield prediction, we need to know what the yield was, we need to know what the yield components are. We also need to know what the dates were, flowering dates and maturity dates, if possible, still quite a challenge. Then the second set of data depends a little bit on your experiments. So if you're interested in comparing rain-fed conditions versus irrigated conditions, would help to have some soil moisture measurements over time. If you're interested in looking at nutrient responses, it would help to take maybe some measurements of soil nitrogen in the soil, and maybe some plant nitrogen measurements as well. But again, it's optional. It's not always required when you want to conduct these simulations. So again, then this summarizes what we call level 1, level 2, and level 3. Level 1, run a crop model. Maybe some other type of model. Well, level 2, compare observations with your simulated data. And level 3, more intense data if you're trying to develop a new model or a new component of your cropping system model. So then getting back to the data standards. So most people agree to the minimum data sets. What becomes more challenging actually then to come up with a data standard. So in the early days of crop modeling, maybe about 15 years ago, we tried to talk to different crop modeling groups to see if they would agree to a uniform data standard. So the groups in the United States representing DSET, as I'm working on, in Australia, EPSIM, there's some modelers in Europe, Wageningen, Germany, but none of us were interested in coming to a common agreement. So then we as a DSET group decided we're going to set our own standards, and already quite a few years ago we developed our own set of standards called the ICASA data standards, and now slowly people are trying to accept the standard across the crop modeling community. So that was the model and the standards. Now to get back to the data. It's another quite challenge. So when we try to obtain data from researchers, we find that most of the data are found in the publications, but when you try to access the data, it becomes more of a challenge. So we actually have a gap between the data that are available and published versus the data that can be able to use. Many of you are familiar with the FAIR principle. In many cases, we can find the data and we can access the data, but actually using the I and the R to make the data more reusable is still quite a challenge and continues to be a challenge as well. Although many funding agencies, at least in the United States, now require that once you've received funding, at the end of your project, you need to make your data available through a repository. So they're findable, accessible, but not reusable. So then when we look at data, the various ways on how we can come up with putting the data together. So we really want to annotate the existing data with existing vocabularies, using, for instance, the ICASA standards, but it's still quite a challenge. And the best way to do it would be to do it up front. So when people collect the data, they can immediately use the data standards, etc. In most cases, that actually is not happening. So it's just happening after the fact. It might be done by a field experiment coordinator, if we're lucky. But in most cases, it's being done by someone else. So this is where we're trying to come up with solutions, and as Shai will be talking about as well, and how we can annotate existing data set to make them more useful for the agro-informatics community. So again, we have a huge gap when we talk about these data. We have the data supply, basically data sitting in databases, various formats. We have the data demand, not just for crop modeling, we also have the data demand for data analytics. Again, AI mentioned earlier, becoming fairly important, and these people are really data hungry. So we have a huge challenge to go from the existing data that we have to make the data useful. So we actually had a project that I will be talking about earlier to try to come up with a solution. And it was quite challenging. So the project was funded by the US government, NIFA, USDA funding agency. So in the early days, the idea was we just take the data that have been collected by the various researchers, we dump them all into a database, we reformat them, and then we can use the data. That's impossible task. It requires a lot of resources. So the solution we try to come up with is keep the existing data sets as they are, but try to come up with tools to annotate them, and then store these annotations that we refer to here as sidecar files with the existing data. And again, that's still quite a challenge too. But probably everybody here in the room, if you're collecting data, you might be collecting yield. If you look at your spreadsheet, each one of you might give it a different name. Maybe in your case, it might even be in Hebrew and not in English. You might be using different units, kilograms per hectare or bushels per acre. You might be using different moisture content, and that is the easiest variable we measure. So quite challenging. So we came up with this concept, what we call the sidecar file, where we can actually try to map data from an existing spreadsheet into the form of the ICASA data formats, store that information with the data sets. So we've developed this whole workflow system where that we can actually then translate the data then the data actually stored, the original data, with this new sidecar file into a repository. And then we also have developed tools to make these data again then available to, in our case, the crop modeling community, but it could also be available to others as well. Now again, this is easier said than done. So the first tool we had to develop is what we call VMapper. So here's an example of an existing spreadsheet, which you might actually have in the format you have. And then with this VMapper tool, we assign to each unique header the ICASA headers I showed from the ICASA standards I showed you earlier. And with this particular tool, when we define each individual column, we can then translate from the unit you used to a standard unit. And that information is then stored in this sidecar file. Again, it requires a lot of work, but it's worthwhile the effort because the original data are not changed. So the only thing we add to it would be the sidecar file. So once we've done that, the data stored in a central repository, we also developed some of the tools to actually search the data together with the Agriculture Library in the United States and discover the data for users by a range of applications. And then again, I don't really have much time to talk about this, but at least in the crop modeling community, there's something called ACMIP, where multiple crop modelers are trying to work together to look at climate change application. And as part of these efforts, we actually have developed translators to go from a standard data set to an individual model format. So you can go to a DSET model, you can go to an EPSA model out of Australia, or go to a European model. So we already have these tools in hand. So here again is an example of these tools. We exchange information from the central database, again, in these tools for crop models, but it can also be used for data analytics. So then the second part would be then translating again the data sets into useful formats. So we developed again this browsery tool. It allows you, as shown here in the bottom, which output formats you can have. We also added another tool to it because again these models require additional information that might not be stored in a database, so we called it a DOME to fill up missing data. And hopefully at the end of the day you have a data set that can be extracted in model format. So as I said earlier, we have been working very closely with the National Agricultural Library, which is based in Beltsville, Maryland. This is funded by the United States government. Originally, they stored all the hard copy books and manuscripts there, but now they're trying to reinvent themselves. So now they've become more of also a digital repository. So they have something called Ag Data Commons, where a lot of research services, especially from USDA government, store the data. So we have been working with them. They've provided us with space. So this is where we have stored some of these data we've converted. So here's an example of some of the data sets we worked with. This project has now ended, but we worked with a variety trial data set out of the University of Georgia, where we converted soybean data, maize data, and various other crops. All the database contains was yield data that is stored that now in this database can be freely downloaded. We also worked with a database of a large project out of the Midwest, looking at corn and soybean systems. Is also stored there with the sidecar files. And we also worked with various other researchers as well. And again, all these data are now available as an example at this Ag Data Commons. Unfortunately, something happened to my URL, but again, you can search it and find it quite easily. As happens with many projects, and we're just discussing that last night over dinner, 3-year project, $1 million. We're done in January. So there will be no continuation. So we demonstrated a concept. It's very useful to us crop modelers, but it's highly unlikely that this activity will be continued. So I'm sure you have similar things happening here in Israel as well. Projects are funded, and then there's no continuation. So that's somewhat discouraging. But again, as we look around, agriculture seems to be moving very rapidly into the digital space as well. People are talking about digital twins, although row crop agriculture might be a little bit behind, especially if you look at controlled environment production system, greenhouse production system. You see a lot of these models already being combined. So there are opportunities not only for these crop models, but we're also looking at remote sensing, imaging, sensing, to bring it all together, to look at predictive systems for the agricultural community. So again, it's always going to be based on fair data. It's going to be requiring a huge amount of data to be available. These data need to be able to communicate with the tools that are being developed. We need to have access to fair data. And in our case, and probably also in other modeling tools cases as well, we need to have this minimum environmental data. We need to have crop management data available. Again, the tools to make these data interoperable is going to become very, very critical. One of the challenges we also face right now, and I'm sure here in the room you all agree that this is useful, but when we talk to the traditional agronomists, they still don't see the use of these approaches. People are more interested in publishing a manuscript than making the data available to the general community, although funding agencies, at least in the United States, require that the data become available. So again, we need to be working with administrators as well to recognize that this is important. And at least in our university system and in the US, again, we're evaluated on number of publications, number of grants, but there should be another column there, how many data sets have you made available to the common good in a repository. So again, thank you for the opportunity to share what we're doing right now with you, and I'll be glad to answer any questions. And again, here are some of the URLs I showed you earlier. Thank you. I agree, but again, the way normally data are presented, if you go back to manuscripts or journal articles, they address a particular study. And normally that is where we find our data. I mean, as a modeler, I'm not conducting any more experiments. I rely on experimentalists to provide us with the data. And I agree there's a lot of overlap between the different data sets. And even what we're trying to model is, in some cases, we might get access to yield data, but no soil data. We're trying to predict yield. In other cases, we're trying to predict greenhouse gas emissions. It's a completely different data set. But I agree, we need to bring them all together as multiple data sets. But even there, it's still, we face the same challenges.
Wonderful presentation. Question on data. With the explosion of digital data, especially with collection of data with the UAVs and sensing, you referred to some of those. Do you have any plans to make these data sets available in the cloud so that people can do the analytics right there instead of downloading individual files? Is there some kind of movement towards that so that we can do run these models
yeah, I mean, remote sensing and continuous data collection is another challenge because there's a huge volume of data I haven't even addressed yet. And again, I'm not in the business of developing a repository in the cloud. I mean, many companies that provide that opportunity for you. So what we are only trying to do here is in this case, we show you examples of how we develop the tools to be able to convert the data. And we're using Ag Data Commons as a place where we store the data right now for our project, but they can be stored anywhere in any repository. And with respect to get back to DSAT proper, all the data we have put in our crop simulation models are freely available through GitHub. So we're providing at least the data that we have in our crop modeling system through the GitHub site, and it's completely open data.
Okay, hi everyone. So my name is Tarin Paz-Kagan, and I will present a joint project with Shachar Baram, that is sitting here, and Ofek, which is the student that is working on this project. And we've got two colleagues also in California, Patrick Brown and Yufan Jin. And the main goal of this project is to understand the to develop a multivariant special decision support system to close something that we call the yield gap, and I will explain in a sec what is a yield gap. And we focus currently in almond orchard, but it's of course something that could be applicable in other orchards. So when we're talking about agriculture production, so yield is of course affected from biotic and abiotical stress. And when we want to look on yield, so we need to look on different parameters and different perspectives that related to genetic and management and environmental condition as mentioned previously. However, usually when we're looking on yield, we usually looked on a plot scale and not looking on the individual tree within the orchard. And one of the aims that we've got is to look on site-specific, which is looking on specific intensity, which is the tree in the orchard, to predict the yield. And in here, we want to evaluate the yield gap based on different parameters that we selected. So the approach of looking on the special variability that we've got within the field is usually through precision agriculture. Previously, you mentioned the remote sensing approach, so I will present the remote sensing approach and AI approach of how we can tackle those issues, how we can look on the yield or the yield gap, which I will explain in a sec, and how we can measure different parameters like nitrogen content, water content, etc., etc. The main idea of precision agriculture is to develop a management zone or a way to evaluate the specific application that we need to apply in the agricultural system to improve yield or to improve the yield use, the nitrogen use efficiency or the yield efficiency. So when we're talking about precision agriculture, so we've got like a cycle, which the first part and the most important part is the data collection, which is the laboring part. And usually we want to know information about the crop, the soil, the terrain, the climate, etc., etc. From the data that we're collecting, we can develop processes and analysis that usually if we want to work on a specific base, tree-specific base, so we need information on the specific tree within the orchard. Based on the information that we're collecting, we can develop a decision support system, and we can apply this decision support system to see if we can improve the application in the agricultural domain. So in here we decided to work on a term that is it's the yield gap. Our colleague Yufan Jin developed a very nice model that what the model is trying to do is to predict the yield or the parameters that affect the yield. And they found a very high correlation between a light intercept to yield, about 90%. However, you can see that on the other hand, we've got a lot of orchard or dots within the model that do not give us the optimal yield that we expected to have. And this is a term as a yield gap. So first of all, we want to understand what is the light intercept or the information that we need to collect in terms of light intercept. And usually the light intercept is highly related to photosynthetic processes of plants and also the structure or the leaf area of the specific plant. In our case, we selected to work on several parameters that we know that affect dramatically yield. The first one was nitrogen, and we decided to look on the nitrogen variation, on the phenology of the effect of phenology on the nitrogen uptake, and the why nitrogen. So first of all, it's of course the most critical parameter for crop yield. In addition, it's affecting photosynthetic and affect additional growth parameter. And basically what we can see when we're looking on almond, specifically on almond, is that there is an increasing in the nitrogen uptake until some level, and then we've got a reduction in the uptake of nitrogen. And basically we want to link between the nitrogen uptake and between the yield gap that we can detect on a tree scale, tree level. One of the things that usually have been done in nitrogen application in almond is there are specific dates that they applied fertilization. Usually it's in the blooming time, in the summer season, and then before the deciduous trees start to leaf out. And those 3 peaks is something that we need to see if the application is in the right time, the right manner, or the right month. Usually it's applied for the entire orchard as one. However, what we want to do is to see if it could be applied site-specifically for the needs for the specific tree within the orchard. So we've got several problems with estimating nitrogen content. The standard procedure for estimating nitrogen content in orchard is by leaf sampling. Usually the leaf sampling is something that we take one specific tree, collect its leaf, send it to a laboratory, do analysis of the nitrogen content, the dry weight of the nitrogen content. Usually it's not representing the entire area. Usually it's represent a specific tree. Usually it's something that has got its limitations, since we've got 2% of nitrogen within the leaf content. And basically, to solve this problem, we need to develop new approaches that related to remote sensing, a different way to analyze those nitrogen level, looking on the spatial domain of those nitrogen level, and develop an integrating approach to look on the nitrogen use efficiency of the orchard. Nitrogen use efficiency, and link it, of course, to the yield gap. So our overall objective was to improve our understanding on the environmental, biological, management factors that affect the complex interaction and that affect yield gap. And for doing so, we developed an approach that is based on remote sensing, mainly by drones, to optimize yield. And we looked on different parameters. Those parameters include mainly irrigation and fertilization. And we use different approaches that related to AI and machine learning models to develop a special decision support system. I won't go into the specific objective, but we selected several parameters. The parameters that I'm going to present now will be mainly in related to water status and to the end pool, to the nitrogen content. But of course, there are different parameters that related to light intercept and to vegetation growth that also consider in the model. And basically what we wanted to do is to look on the environmental, the biological, and the management factors that affecting this yield gap. We used high-resolution drones, and we use high-resolution satellites. And we developed an approach to look on the management zones, or the application of management zone for fertilization application and irrigation. So the system that we worked with was 4 plots, 3 in California and 1 in Israel. The one is basically 3 plots in Israel. I will present mainly the result that we've got from Israel, but the same experiment is applied parallel also in California, in UC Davis, and also in Israel. The dots that you can see in here are the trees that we are sampling, and the effort to collect the data is huge. It's huge effort, and this is one of the issues that we need to understand. So we'll be able to develop those model and prediction model also in AI and also with remote sensing or with modeling. We have to collect huge amount of data and information that we can interpolate for something that will have knowledge about the management. So which data we collected? So those are the trees. This is how one tree looks like. You can see that we've got a lot of sensors, including dendrometers, including subflow, including measurement of leaf nitrogen content in different level of the trees, including stem water potential, an additional parameter that we're collecting from 60 trees within the orchard, so we can take this information and then model it based on remote sensing data to a regional scale. The data that we're collecting from the remote sensing is based on fusion approach, which the fusion approach is to integrate several sensors, not just one. It is to integrate RGB, multispectral or hyperspectral data, thermal data that can give us information about the stress condition or the evapotranspiration condition of the plant, and LiDAR data that can give us information about the structure or the leaf intercept or the growth of the plant. So basically in one drone flight, we've got 4 sensors that can capture different information about the crop system. One of the most important parts, usually in remote sensing, we usually look on the spectral signal, but very important information is also the structural information about the trees. And the structural information from the trees is to look on the volume of the trees, the growth of the trees, and additional parameters that could help us in modeling the dynamic and the phenology of those trees. The LiDAR information, this is an active sensor, which basically what we can see is the 3-dimensional structure of the orchard. And based on the 3-dimensional structure of the orchard, we can extract information about the growth, the height, the volume, the plant area index, leaf area index of the tree, and additional parameters that related to each specific tree within the orchard. So we develop an approach that predicts nitrogen content, and the nitrogen content approach is to multiply the leaf nitrogen content that we usually measured in the field with the volume, the leaf area index of the plants. And here what you can see is a support vector machine model that enables us to predict for each tree within the orchard the level of nitrogen that we've got in the orchard. It means that now we can visualize and not use a specific tree with a leaf sampling that we're taking from several trees, but to extend the entire orchard and to understand the nitrogen content for each one of those trees. In addition, we use thermal sensing, the crop water stress index, which can give us information about the stressful condition of the trees and the evapotranspiration processes. Those, of course, interlink with sensors that we've got on the trees. So this is the crop water stress index. And lastly is to evaluate the yield. And this is a very tough issue. Evaluating yield, usually what we've got is we've got like an average yield for the entire polygon of the entire orchard. But if we want to work on a tree-based level, then we've got a problem. In Israel, we don't have machines that go through tree by trees and weight the yield. And I will show you later on what we did to have information about yield, which is labor work. But in California, they've got machines that can give us information on a tree-based yield, which of course improve the ability to predict models. And in here, what first of all we did, and this is our colleagues from California, they took different information from spectral data, structural data, and used several machine learning approach to try and predict yield based on the information that we've got from drones. So a bit of the results. In here you can see the 3 plots that we've got in Israel. You can see the reduction, the phenology, the effect of the phenology of the nitrogen contents that we've got in 2 different cultivars in almonds, the 53 and El-Fachem. We've got significant differences in the nitrogen uptake in those 2 cultivars. Additional thing that we tested is the differences between the leaves that in the upper part of the tree and in the lower part of the tree. And you can see that at the end of the season, there are significant differences between the variation in the nitrogen content within the tree, which is also something that need to be considered when we're working with the remote sensing model. For example, the drone sees the upper part of the canopy, and if we're measuring nitrogen in the lower part of the canopy, we won't represent the actual nitrogen content in the specific tree. So now this is how it looks like when we're looking on the variation that we've got within the orchard. And you can see those are different dates for drone flights, and you can see the dots and the variation in the nitrogen content for each one of those trees. Additional parameter that we took was the maximum daily shrinking, which is a parameter that highly correlated with the stressful condition. And you can see that there is differences between soil moisture and the shrinking of the trunk. And in here you can see again the variation that we've got between two cultivars that sit in the same orchard, between 53 and the El-Fahim. Those are two cultivars that we've got in Israel. And you can see that this variation increased dramatically during the season. It means that if we want to develop models, we need to look on the phenology, on the dynamic of the phenology in terms of nitrogen and water status. And this is how it looks like when we're looking on two specific dates, and the variation that we've got in the growth, and the variation that we've got in the MDS parameter. It means that there is a huge variation. Next was to try and evaluate yield, and this is how this is what we needed to do to collect yield data. So basically, this is a machine that goes into the tree and shake the tree, so we'll have the ability to collect all the fruits. There are a net on the floor, and then we need to collect those nets and weight each one of those nets, the yield of each one of those nets, to evaluate the overall yield for each tree within the region. It's a very labor work. And of course, machine could help us do it much faster and much easier, and we hope that in the coming year we'll have machines like this. But the guys from California, which have a machine like this that have a weight average of each one of those trees, develop a convolution neural network model, which they integrated multispectral and structural information and had a high accuracy of predicting yield with a 0.96 prediction of yield for each tree in the orchard. Once we've got the information about yield, now we can start to understand the causes of the variation in the yield. And the causes of the variation in the yield should be related to management factor that we can control. For example, irrigation, fertilization, et cetera, And this is the next step in our approach. So to conclude this specific project, we aim to develop a decision support system that looking on a specific tree within an orchard. Today we don't have application, for example, for specific fertilization for each one of the trees. We're working in management zones. So we also developed an approach of how integrate all this information into management zones. And basically the use of remote sensing approach like UAVs and satellites and sensors on the ground and integrating all of this information could give us an ability to predict yield and give us an ability to manage our plot more wisely in terms of nitrogen and in terms of water use efficiency. Thank you. If you've got questions, I will be more than happy to answer. Between the variables? So the
not between the variables, within the variable.
Again?
Spatial correlation within a variable.
Okay. So of course there is a special correlation, and one of the things that we're looking on the special correlation within and between the variables. Usually when we're applying a model like an AI model, we're not plugging in all the data that we collected. We're using only information that it's, so we won't have a redundancy in the model. So we don't have a special within and between correlation in the parameters. I hope that I answer your question. Any more questions?
When you say prediction, not any ask. Use the notion of solving differential equations in time, because prediction would be the evolution in time. What you do is kind of data.
So what we do is prediction is you can interpolate prediction in different ways. And what we do is we're using those sampling trees that we've got data on them to train a model. And usually we need to have a lot of data set for that. So for example, we've got 63, multiply the time that we visit in the field. So this is the data that go into the model. We're applying different machine learning model, and then the model gives us some approach some information about the prediction ability and the accuracy of the model. Then we can apply this model for the entire image. And based on that, we can understand the different variation that we've got between the different trees within the orchard. So first of all, you've got a statistical measurements that you can evaluate the accuracy of your model, the RMSE, the RPD, additional parameters to evaluate the accuracy of your model. And of course, the best way to do it is to go to the field and measure it again and see if you're accurate enough in terms of the variation that you detected in your model. Sorry, we'll talk later on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Shai. I'm going to speak about quantification of soil health, which means using indices to quantify the soil health, and mainly autocorrelation, interpolation, and machine learning tools to map the soil health within the catchment scale, which means a methodological talk. And basically, the mapping is our claim to fame, because there are very many works on soil health, but not very many mapping works of soil health. So just to be on the same page, soil health means the ability, or indicates on the ability of the soil to provide ecosystem services like productivity and erosion regulation, and gas exchange, and so on. So basically, we are talking about functioning, soil functioning. These are my collaborators. Most of the study is based on in Bar Hasid's master thesis, but since then we did a lot of progress with all those great guys from Cornell and UK and BGU. Okay, so what damages soil health? It's mainly soil erosion processes. As you can see here, soil water erosion processes in agricultural fields that are being cultivated by traditional methods are in one order of magnitude higher than those of open areas and of conservation tillage and of soil production, which makes the problem irreversible, because the soil production is much lower in rate than the soil erosion. And this is how it appears in the field. As you can see, gullies and sheet flow that damages the entire Ramot Menashe field. And this is Rami Zeidenberg inside a single event gully. And this is Beni Yacobi inside a long-term event gully. So the damage is very strong and visible. And it's not only nice photos. As we can see here from the work in Science in 2015, using data from 1991 until 2015, the areas around the world that suffer water erosion severity in different levels are the bluish areas. So we are talking about a worldwide phenomena. You can see all those areas. So it's a big problem. So what do we do about it? We try to identify areas under risk using remotely sensed data and models. Then we use spatial decision support systems to try to defend those fields. And in the meantime, we monitor, ongoing monitoring of soil health by using indicators. But to do that, we need to be able to work on a catchment scale, because from the administrative point of view, we need to be able to apply conservation tillage tools on a field basis. And it's much more clear when you analyze the data on a tangible unit such a catchment. So what they do in most part of the world, they just sample in different fields that have the money to do that. And what we try to do is to aggregate it to the level of an agricultural catchment. So you need to map it over large areas using point measurements. So to do that, you need first to create indices, soil health indices, so that the soil health quantification will be quantitative based on soil variables. Then you need to study the continuity of those soil variables in space by using different autocorrelation tools. Then you can interpolate the data. And finally, you can use machine learning tools to better understand the processes that create those soil health maps. So that's the strategy. So methodology. So first we select the soil health indicators out of a huge list of 40 variables that experts decided that may be the soil properties that affect soil properties in the Harod catchment. And this is why you can't see it, because it's 40 properties. We use a Pearson correlation plot to find those properties that correlate with each other. And then all the white ones are those properties that do not correlate. So the colors are for those that correlate. And then you can use a dendrogram analysis, which based on a cluster analysis based on the Pearson data, and you can create groups of variables. This is, of course, not the entire list, because I wanted you to see the dendrograms. But then you can pick a specific property from each family of properties that act the same. So you don't need to measure all of them. So we ended up with 12 soil properties, chemical, biological, and physical. That should be the soil properties that will quantify soil health in our catchment. Then we use a weighted linear combination to combine them into a single soil health score. And then it only begins. Then you need to map it over a large area, 130 square kilometers. So you need to sample it in an educated way. You need to study the continuity in space, the autocorrelation of those properties. Then you can interpolate them if you see some good autocorrelation trend. And finally, you can use random forest to study the underlying processes on these soil health maps. So we begin with data collection very quickly, 130 points that costed $50,000 to sample them. So it's a lot of money. Replicates winter season under field capacity, top 10 centimeters. And analyzed in a standard soil lab. Then you need to sample. This is the first act, so you need to sample them. So most of the people, they just randomly sample the points in space. They do the block and sample it randomly. We wanted also to test stratified random, and we used for the strata the flow accumulation matrix, hill slope gradient, and soil type from the soil types map of Israel. Then we used a binary tree to create the strata, and we sampled in each strata randomly points proportionally to its size. Then the autocorrelation analysis, I will do it quickly. You compute the covariance, which means the multiplication of the distance from the mean in different bands. The H are the bands. And divided by the variances, and this is the autocorrelation coefficients. We use its inverted cousin, which you all know very well, the covariance, the semi-empirical variance, or the SN ratio. The second measure that we used was Moran I, which is quite similar, but it uses also the inverse distance or square distance as a weight for the distance for the points. And finally, again, we used a semi-variogram using a variogram envelope, which implies on the significance of the autocorrelation using a Monte Carlo simulation and permutations, which means basically that you switch between the values of the points, and if the points along the autocorrelation lengths draw out from the envelope, it means that there is a significant autocorrelation. Then we tested two Kriging interpolation techniques. The ordinary Kriging, very simple, just based on the semi-variogram, the weights, and multiplied by the value of the known points. And the Kriging with external drift, using both slope and elevation. Elevation was better, to give weights for the Kriging based on the elevation of the points. Finally, in the methodology part, the random forest, we used the random forest to create classes of differences in probability from the highest soil health class. So it's a continuous number of probability to explain those values based on the unpaved roads, their directions and barriers from erosion, hill slope decline, rainfall intensity, land use, which means cultivation method, contributing area, and aspect, slope aspect, as a proxy for evaporation. Okay, the result. The stratified random is much more recommended. You see, it's half of the RMSE, of the total RMSE, than the random. So for all of you who do random, I suggest to reconsider. Autocorrelation analysis have shown that not all the properties are continuous in scale, available water capacity, pH, RH, but it differs between the indices. So for example, using the Moran's I, in many of the variables, we can see a significant autocorrelation. All those red dots, you can see it from here, all those red dots. So very many of the properties autocorrelates, very good. You can use interpolation. But when you look at the SN, you can see that many of the properties do not have. So there is a difference between the indices. And similarly in the variogram envelope, which was the most sensitive indicator, or the most sensitive indicator to the autocorrelation. Okay, this is what we see here as a summary. You can see many more properties in the variogram envelope which do not show continuity in space. But if you run simply Moran's I, okay, no problem. There is a continuity in space. You can run your Kriging interpolation and have the results. We can see here that comparing the ordinary Kriging with the Kriging with external drift, we get better results with the Kriging in external drift with the slope than the OK. So it's better to use a covariate with the Kriging interpolation. And the random forest analysis, here we see the final table, and we will focus mainly on the final score. This is the weights value for all those variables for predicting all the soil properties, but we will focus here. So we can see here that the first and most important variable that affects soil health in the Harod catchment was, think for a second, rainfall intensity. This is our results from meteorological radar data. The second one was the slope gradient, and the third one was the contributing area. Surprisingly, the cultivation method was only the fourth. It's very similar to aspect. And the use of both Kriging, interpolation, and the random forest allows us to predict the soil health in the catchment scale. These are the points. And you can see the maps. The score vary between 20 to 74, which is a nice range. And this is based on the points solely and the external drift, which was the slope. And this one is based only on the predicting variables, not on the measured data, only the predicted variables. They look the same, they have their differences, but we have a clear picture of the catchment because this is where the river goes. And these are the areas near Afula, Givat Amore, and so on, lower scores. So we can have a map. So for the conclusions, first of all, it's possible to study the autocorrelation of the catchment, spatial autocorrelation, understand it, be more cautious regarding several variables, but we can map it on a catchment scales using 130 points. Stratified random is much more recommended than simply random sampling. The most harsh, rigorous method for autocorrelation analysis is the variogram envelope as alternative to Moranzai and also to seal nugget ratio. KD is more recommended, but you need to select with cautious the covariate, which was the slope in our case. And random forest showed that the most important variables to affect soil health in the Harod catchment was rainfall intensity, hill slope gradient, and contributing area. That's it.
Yes, I can understand the area. So how do you account for that?
So we don't have a reference from before. We don't have a measurement.
So you might have areas. It's very healthy for its
Yes.
region the way it is. So
Yes, we don't have longitudinal analysis.
say so the soil is healthy.
Yes, but
It might be very poor soil, so it's
yes.
relatively very unhealthy compared to very fertile soil. So
Yes, so we cannot compare it to other areas. The entire function runs between the lowest value of this catchment at this moment and the highest value. So we don't have a record
so poor soils within the catchment will have
within the catchment.
within
will
the
have the
catchment
lowest.
will have low,
Yes.
even though they might be in a good condition
Compared
to what they are.
to other areas or what happened before. Is that what you mean? Yes. It's true. Yes, the function runs only between the values that we measure. So we can measure other areas, which we didn't do, and other time steps, and then compare it. But the function, the soil health function, I didn't show it, but the soil health function runs between the lowest value in the catchment and the highest.
Move to the next presentation. Tal will be here right after the session ends. I have many questions for you. Thank you, Tal. We have Aviva Peeters from Vision Lab, right? Okay, you have say that and thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Aviva Peeters. I actually represent two hats here. One is a company which deals with developing decision support systems called TerraVision Lab. And the other is Sami Shamon, SCE College of Engineering from Be'er Sheva. And I'll be talking about a decision support tool for optimizing spatial sampling in precision agriculture, but not only about that. You'll see I'll present more models that are actually supporting this model. All this thing is part of a larger, broader project, a European Horizon 2020 project, which has several partners here. You can see part of them from Volcani Institute and from the Hebrew University and Ariel University, but there are much more. We were like 16, 17 different institutions, and it's a project. The project is called Shui or Shui in Chinese, which means water, and dealing with different decision support systems. So how do we get from data to decision making? So I guess you will all recognize this thing, which is actually leads to a decision support system. So we have lots of data. This thing collects, to the ones who do not know what this is, a navigation system, a driving navigation system, Waze or whatever you have in your country. And it really collects a lot of data about the traffic and the police and the accidents, and sometimes even attributes about the data. So for example, if we're looking at traffic, it can be moderate traffic or heavy traffic. And this is the case in our world. We have a lot of data. We have an avalanche of data. And we've been seeing here in all the other presentations about really all these amazing sensors that are collecting what we call today really big data. But the question is, how do we get from that to actually deciding, because this would not help us decide how to get in the shortest, fastest way from one point to the next, right? So in order to make this straightforward decision making, we actually need something which is a simple, user-friendly decision support system that really tells us to go from A to B, and might also come with some options, different objective functions. For example, I would like to go only through scenic roads, or I would like to stop on the way and have a coffee, and so on. And what happens in the world of agriculture? So you might be recognizing this, and you for sure, all of you here know about more systems. There are a lot of different decision support systems in the world of agriculture that do all kinds of things. They might be doing optimization of crop rotation, or systems that really look at the entire farm and look at the economic aspects as well, or looking at the crop health. So we might be going from really the scale of the entire farm to the scale of the field. And what we recognized was really that there is this gap between really combining all these amounts of data and actually helping the farmer take decisions. And one of the things that we also saw is that there are very few systems that are accounting for really the in-field scale. That means accounting for the spatial variability, what you've been seeing in all the presentations before these ones. So the important thing was really to be able to develop models that can account for this spatial variability, to be able to address different objective functions, to be based on relatively accessible data. Again, accessible data is a definition which is a bit fluid, because it's a matter of really time and money and different scales of farms, whether it's a small scale farm in China or an enormous farm in the US. So it really, it's a bit of a fluid definition. And we wanted to develop a user-friendly application, and that can be also low cost. In this case, you'll see it's a free application because, as I said, it's part of a Horizon 2020 project. Everything has to be free. All data, there is this project, if you will go to this Shui website, all the data is accessible. There's a repository. And so our objective was really to develop decision support algorithms And based on them, decision support systems, and finally, a decision support tool that will help us optimize water management in crops. So this was our major criteria. As I said, spatial, generalized, practical, and accessible. And all our models actually followed this process. We began with the data and collected data. Again, I did not collect the data, others collected the data for me. Remote sensing data and plant-related data, and of course yield and past yield, and soil and different environmental attributes related to the topography, and then derived indices from these different variables. Then came the process of integrating and analyzing the data with different models, deriving patterns, and based on this, developing the decision support tool that will be able to really allow this optimized decision. We based the models on a few case studies, and you can see they are very varied. The case studies in Israel and in Europe, vineyards and field crops, and variable rate irrigation center pivot, different locations in Israel, and yeah, different sizes, different partners from Czech Technical University and University of Cordova, and more. And we developed three major models. One model was a model for delineating management zones, a spatial-based multivariate model. Then another model, a random forest-based model, a spatial random forest-based model for predicting. First, we began with a crop water stress index, which Tarin was talking about, and we are working now on adapting that model for predicting also yield and soil water status, and a multivariate spatial stratified sampling model, or for placing sensors. All the models integrate machine learning algorithms, and particularly random forest, together with spatial statistical algorithms, because what we realized is that, again, machine learning models like random forest are not inherently spatial models. So in order to be able to account for the spatial autocorrelation, we had to introduce spatial statistics into the models. So this is one model developed for this center pivot in the northern Negev, which is the management zone delineation model. So we began with data, and here again I'm just showing part of the data. Okay, but you can see here there is electrical conductivity, and crop water stress index, and past yield, and an index which can be derived from the topography, the topographic wetness index, and DVI. And so now all this input data is being transformed into something which is called Z-scores. And this thing actually introduces the spatial algorithms into the equation. And then all these different clustering models are being combined together in order to create this multivariate clustering model, which is the basis for the management zones, what you can see here. The second model, and you'll see eventually how all the models are combined together, is a prediction model, which again is based again on the same type of calculations that you've seen before, again taking spatial statistical algorithms in order to derive the spatial structure, and using random forest in order to do predictions. In this case, predictions for crop water stress index. We use that because crop water stress index is used in different types of crops in order to take decisions about considering irrigation. So again, we begin with, and you can see, of course, that all the data that we're based on is data that has to be spatial, because we want to be able to do this, for example, prediction for every location. And what we get eventually is what you see here on the left is really, as I said, a prediction in this model for a crop water stress index, a prediction for each tree. Now, of course, we are not managing each tree, well, we are not there still, like irrigating each single tree. So what we are more interested is actually looking at the, like an averaging based on either management cells or management zones. And here we're talking about the vineyard in the Judean Hills, which is managed based on, the irrigation is managed based on irrigation cells. What you can see here, what I actually highlighted here is really the effect of taking, it's like comparing between the non-spatial random forest models and the spatial random forest models. The minute you really introduce space in those models, there is a really, and we've seen it again and again, there is a very large jump in the accuracy of the models and how the models are performing. Of course, you can see that there are some issues. There are issues, for example, with the extremes, okay? And one can see it here. Here we see it per each tree, but we can see it also here with the management zones. Of course, also this is an important indication because it tells us what cells are, the prediction is less accurate, okay? Where do we have to do some modifications? And as I said, we are trying now to take that model, for example, and see whether, of course, if we does changes in the, what's called the hyperparameters, if we do modifications, if we can take it in order to do, for example, predictions of yield. And in this case, it's a field in Spain. Again, looking at the spatial structure. The third model is this special sampling model. And as Tal correctly said before me, if we are dealing with spatial data and we want to go and do like the traditional ways of sampling, okay, whether it is sampling within a grid or random sampling, it doesn't do it. We might be really missing, and we might be getting, we might be either missing unimportant data or having too many samples in a place, in an area which has a high spatial autocorrelation, and we might have then redundancy in the samples. So what we decided is really to follow, again, a similar procedure and go into the stratified-based sampling. Because what we had from before was actually ready strata. We have the management zones. Okay? The management zones are areas that are relatively homogeneous, okay? Because we recognized them before. So we can use them in order to do the sampling within each management zone. So again, we began in the same way, and here we're looking at the field in the Czech Republic. Again, accounting for the spatial structure, using this in order to do this clustering and derive from that the management zones. And well, there are some more other things that have been applied here, like for example, some spatial constraint, like a minimum distance, again based on the spatial autocorrelation, in order to not to have, for example, samples too close together, that we are not sampling from exactly the same homogeneous data. And then after really receiving these management zones, sampling again based in order to, let's say, if we have, let's say, a sample, we want to sample 90 samples, instead of taking and throwing in 3 management zones, 30 and 30 and 30, we want to actually do it again based on the spatial autocorrelation in order not to have this redundancy. So what we did is we developed an index, a multivariate autocorrelation index. Again, I didn't give here all the names of the different statistics, but this one specific is based on something which is called the multivariate Gerrit C statistics. So it takes into account all the different attributes. And in this way, actually this index serves as a weight. So then an area, for example, like the blue area, which has a very high spatial correlation, will receive less samples than an area which has, which is like more heterogeneous. Okay, I hope I kind of made myself clear. So I said in the beginning that we wanted to develop simple decision support tools and not just to stay within the models. So we have now a tool which is a web-based tool. It's still within the group, but within the next 2 months it will be public. Of course, it has a different background about the project and about the different data that was collected. It has also, for example, a sample data that one can use in order to try the tool, and we will really spread out the word once it's public, because we want people really to try it in order to see actually what are the problems with it and to be able to update it. But the main part of this tool is, of course, in this case, the prediction. But again, this tool is going eventually also to be able to offer also a sampling. But as of now, it offers a prediction. All one has to do is actually load the CSV file that has, of course, location, X and Y, but all the other input, I'm finishing, the other input variables, and select the model that you want, and one can also add GIS management zone layer, so you can do not only per tree predictions, but also per management zones. And the outputs are, again, either outputs as predictions per tree or predictions per management zones, and different graphs, like correlation graphs and variable importance charts, and also ready shape files that can be combined in a GIS system. And in terms of the conclusions, so we really realized in this 4 years of research that, and we tried not only random forest, we tried also boosted regression tree model, and we saw that whenever we're adding, really combining in the model, right, accounting for the spatial structure, the models are really, the accuracy of the model is increased significantly. This is just the beginning, because really, as I said, we still have to combine. Also, we want to do adjustments to the different models to be able to have them more generalized and add the sampling aspect. You can find more information in these 2 websites, which are describing this research. And in addition, I didn't want to say, but all this list lots of publications and publications that are still in the making. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aviva.
Aviva, forgive my naive thinking, but my understanding was that you compare sampling various spatial notions. What about time? Same space, different times. What about information? Same space, different time, different information. You do that.
Yeah, well, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Of course you do.
Yeah, we have a paper together exactly about that, about the information. The thing is like this. There was also an aspect of time. Okay, dealing with dynamical management zones, and actually my other half is there. Alon Bengal is talking exactly about that, about the changing of really, for example, management zones, and of course predictions are time-based, because you're collecting data and then you would like to predict for a different time, So correct.
Thank you. Okay, the next speaker will be myself. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for attending the session. I think we had a great session so far. I'm the last presentation. My name is Shai Sela. I'm the chief scientist of a startup called Agro-Informatics. And we're dealing with data standardization and modeling. And the title of my talk today is about how data standardization can foster collaboration. And when you collaborate, you're able to have new insights, and it really accelerates your research. And I speak about this now. Okay, so if you look at the agronomic domain, you have millions of trials conducted every year, right? So this goes on all the way from fully statistical trials from universities, okay? We have replicates, and you have an hypothesis, and you have all these beautiful approaches that Tal and Aviva presented, right? You have a designed experiment. And the other side of the spectrum are farmers. They have multiple like demo plots that they're doing. Let's take this part of the field, let's test something. Farmers are always testing something, okay? And in between, you have research institutes and field agronomists, and of course, private companies, if you think of chemical companies, if you think of food and beverages and so on. Millions and millions of trials conducted every year. Now, when a trial is conducted nice or in a good way, you have beautiful data to work with. So this is from a collaboration we have with Michael Castellano from Iowa State University. This is from nitrogen response curves, okay? They had long-term experiments of nitrogen response. Everything is known. You know the drainage system, you know the seeding density, you know the hybrid, you know everything. And you have this response where the only thing that's changed is the nitrogen. And when you have that, you have beautiful insights when you can work with. So you have a good coverage of this parameter space, in this case, of the nitrogen rate. There is a huge missed potential, okay? Data out there are collected in a variety of methods. Some use their own protocols, some use other. Unlike fintech, unlike healthcare, there are no standards in agronomy. This is something really unique. There are no standard notations, there are no standard reporting. It's just, there's no standard protocols. And in many times, scientists are collecting a lot of data. They're not, well, in most cases, they're not using all of it, okay? They're keeping it for a good day. When I have the time, I go back, I open a drawer, I'll make the best out of that. It doesn't really happen, right? I mean, you end up with folders in your computer with beautiful data waiting, and they still wait. I mean, you can then use it, okay? You need to increase the return on investment when you have a grant which you win, okay? If, for example, you for every buck that you spend, if you had more data, more experiments, if you have the data that you collect will be reusable, and Gerrit talked about it a bit, and I will have a slide on that. You have a better return on your investment, and in the end, it can enable collaboration, right? What you really need is standardization. If you have standardization, you can collaborate, you can cover this parameter space, and hopefully you can uncover new insights. Why standardization and transparency are needed? First example, okay? Tal Svoray was my PhD advisor back at the time, okay? Maybe he recognized that. So I brought my own data, okay? I dug into the folder. So this is a spreadsheet which we had, for my PhD file. We have many different columns here. I mean, do I have a pointer here? Yeah. Okay. N, alpha, theta, we know it's Van Genuchten. I recognize that, of course. But, there is RAD ratio 2. RF 2011. Okay, I know what these are, but when if for some reason Tal and I would not be in contact, and Tal wants to share this data with his colleague, it's really hard. I mean, how would he interpret that? And this is my own data, okay, back at the time. Next example. These are, so we have a standardization system at Agmatics. Sure. We have a standardization system at Agmatics. These are real examples of data that we receive. For example, you would be amazed how many variation you can find for plant height or for nitrogen rate of application. You know, people have capital, lowercase, typos, some have units in, some have don't. And if you will ever want to join these multiple files, if you want to collaborate, so how do people collaborate? They all go and say, let's open a Dropbox folders, okay? Everyone just upload the data to the Dropbox folder, and now what? So this, usually a technician or a student needs to sit and kind of unify and make sure that, you know, all the N inputs in all the files are the same and so on. There's a lot of variability in this file. Researchers tend to save the data in ways that they understand. Okay, last example. You're all researchers. Let me ask you, if I give you data from someone you don't know, beautiful data from Brazil or you name it, whatever, would you use it? And many people start to move uncomfortably in their chair when I ask these questions because we don't like to use other people's data. This is the reality. We like our own data. We like to measure. And this is a real quote. I will not use data measured by someone else I don't know. I take great care to ensure consistent protocols on my measurements. Other protocols can affect the measured values. I don't know them, so it will be very hard for me to use the data. We need metadata. We need to understand the protocols. We need to keep all this extended metadata, the long tail of knowledge for each data point so we can share it and people can use it. Okay? Fair concept. Gerrit presented already beautifully in his presentation. Findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. The first two, relatively easy. You need the data to be findable. You just Google it or have a database. I mean, you can download it. Making it interoperable and reusable, very difficult, okay? So this is from Data 1, which is a repository. So the red ones are the findable and accessible. So this is over the years, and this is the scores, the FAIR scores. And you can see that interoperable and reusable are always lower than findable and accessible. It's very hard to make data to make sense to people that don't know. I mean, you need a lot of metadata to really make that reusable. There are solutions out there, okay? And Gerrit presented the ICASA standards, and there are other, you know, the CGIR has beautiful work with agro firms and the standards that they're tools that they have to make standardization. Some of them are public, some of them are private. Private cost money. In many times, you know, the user experience is maybe more smoother, maybe it's automatic, maybe it's less labor intensive, but they all work beautiful. And please take this picture and check these solutions. Okay, this is very. If there's one take-home message from this, please use these systems. One of these systems is Agmatics, so we are a data standardization solution. And here I will demonstrate using our system. There are other systems like I show here, okay? So the way to increase the interoperability and reusability of the data using ontologies, Gerrit discussed it a bit. Here, this is a graph plot from using our, so we developed an ontology library. It's called the GUARDS, Growers Universal Agronomic Research Data Standard. And here is just an example. So every data point in the database is mapped to every other data point, okay? So the nitrogen content, you can know if it's in the leaf or in the grain. There's many options, right, that it can be. In the soil and so on, you know it's a chemical test, you know it's an output, you know the protocols, if we have the data and we map the protocols, okay? The beautiful part is that it's not live yet, but in the near future, this can be turned into a knowledge graph. And then, for example, user of the system can ask, you know, so if you know so your field agent says, listen, the lab results came, we have magnesium deficiencies. Okay, I want to test it, right? What do I do? I mean, if you can now do semantic search on this type of knowledge graph, what affects magnesium, you have results instant from the system, which can save you time. I mean, what's the alternative? You go into the Web of Science, you search what's affecting magnesium in crop, whatever crop you're doing. So this can be a time saver and basically accelerate the research. But we're not there yet, but in the near future. Okay, 2 examples I want to present. Corn yield prediction model. This is basically an exercise that I did just to demonstrate the usability of the system. Here I have 20 different sources of data, okay? Coming from different sources. So there are published papers. This is basically from a metadata analysis from Eagle et al., which is submitted to the PURR repository in Purdue, available to the public. We have data from North Carolina, from machinery, My John Deere, from colleagues. We have other collaborators that shared the data. Overall, 20 different sources, close to 3,700 or 3,800 observations. All the data are ingested in Agmatic system. They are being unified. You end up, you can look at the yield histogram. Let's say that you now decide that you want more low yields to cover better this parameter space, so you bring more data and you basically make sure that you cover the parameter space that you need. And what we wanted to do here is to enrich the data, so we have a growing degree day model that used to delineate the different growth stages. This is for corn follow growing degree days, so it's relatively easy. And the idea is to identify windows of interest, or basically, when does corn, we know, so for example, between 10 leaves and tasseling, that's a critical stage for corn. If you have water deficiency or nutrient deficiencies in that stage, it will affect your yield. So we can have a growing degree day and map all the growth stages for every one of these experiments. And we end up with a nice list of covariates. So this is the model inputs: total nitrogen, organic matter, texture, previous crop, and then we have these 16 weather indices. This is the test data. If you have a good covariate and you have a good coverage of the parameter space, you make sure that you have enough data to train, right, the model through all this parameter space. And this is the trained data, right? So this is the validation data, and this is comes up beautiful, right? So you have in the end around 1 ton of error, about 6% if you look at the range of the yield. Okay, so then you can do sensitivity analysis, feature permutation, standard procedure. Here, what we found that, for example, water availability between 10 leaves and tasseling really emerges as an important predictor for corn yield. Okay, the idea is that now you can have each one of these affecting parameters, you can dive in and look into that, and maybe there are new insights, right, that you can now derive from that. Last example, so we're collaborating with many companies at Agmatics. This is a collaboration we have with Wageningen University and the International Fertilizer Association, and APNI and ISDA. So this is basically the effort of 2 visionary people, Akim Doberman from IFA and Martin van Itersum from Wageningen. They had this vision of creating a global crop nutrient removal database. Do you want to learn about spatial, global trends? How do you do that? I mean, no single lab has data of all the global coverage. So they circulated a call for data. And 71 labs responded, shared from 35 countries. We now have more, this is not updated, I think it's close to 20,000 experiments in the system. How would you do manually that? It's impossible. We have the algorithm in the back that do that, so it automates the whole and streamlines. These fragmented files are now unified into a database. And once you have the data, you can analyze it. So this is the first analysis. You see good coverage of the locations. And one of the interesting, for example, findings, this is the nitrogen concentration in corn. You can see huge variation between regions. We're now looking into that. Why do you have Asia have higher grain and concentration, and so on? A first paper out of this project already out. Cameron Ludman, he's a researcher in Wageningen, and he used this database to look into how the harvest index changes in different regions of the world, and they have machine learning models to predict that. It's a very interesting paper. Field crop research just out recently. The point is, when you collaborate, you can have new insights generated, and this is very well demonstrated here. I mean, he would not be able to do that without the data shared by other people, okay? Okay, I think I'm good in time, maybe a bit early even. So I will summarize. So the vision is to have, standardization frequently used. There are tools out there. Every one of you can use them. Some are free, some cost money. But please use them. It will allow you to collaborate, So I just came back from Baltimore, from the ASA, the annual agronomic America Society of Agronomy meeting. Everyone is talking about collaboration. Everyone wants to collaborate. Everyone acknowledges that it's good and it's needed. There are huge questions we're trying to address. But how do you do that? I mean, how do you collaborate? If, for example, you come up 5 researchers, you want to work together, how would you do that? Everyone will bring 100, 200 files into a Dropbox folder. Now what? It's not efficient. And maybe this is something that relates to what Gerrit presented. I think to increase or to make the collaboration more efficient, you need to make the user experience easier, okay? Because researchers, even when you have the files ready for them, like CASA, the VMapper, you have tools that help them standardize the data. It's hard for them. It's hard for them to do it, and hopefully automation can bring us further down the line. Yeah, that's it. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Please.
Rather than the notion of standardization, I would like to refer you to the notion of Boltzmann entropy. In other words, whatever you consider as entropy relates directly to information, or information gives you knowledge, right? So the notion that comes out of that is causality-driven directed information. In other words, you don't need standardization. You want to use the facts, which are information, for a specific knowledge. Don't look for standardization. Look for whatever you want to get.
So, 2 thoughts regarding this comment. Thank you. First of all, many times, researchers collect data for one purpose, and then other people see other potential in it for other research, right, from other disciplines. So you don't really know what the data will end up used for. Now, in the end, I agree with what you say, but in the end, you need a file. You need a unified file. How would you technically join all these thousands of different files used for these 15,000 experiments? You need standardization in the sense that you need naming to be similar or unified so you can join them technically into creating this large file. Okay, so this is technically. I understand what you're saying about entropy, but standardization here is needed to make it pragmatically workable. You understand what I'm saying?
I do, but I don't necessarily agree.
Any other questions or comments? Yes.
So, I don't know if we're part of the collaboration with Wageningen. So what I want to ask is, was the standardization done before the collection or after the collection of the data?
to the collection. These are historical files. So the researchers sent us 20, 30 years old files. They were sitting in their folders. I mean, why not let the scientific world use that? I mean, most people would not really go back to data they collected 30 years ago, you know, and someone else can make a good use for that, and we advance the science, and this is the collective power, right? So this is all the data are historical.
Like Agro-Informatics is proposing to create a platform to make standardization easier.
Yeah, so we can either standardize legacy data, and in order not to go back and do that again and again and again, we have a set of tools where data now, third data, we have an app, we have a trial planning app, and so on. And data are collected using the standards already, so that's just been going to the historical data, so you can have a unified database. Yeah. Yes, Gerrit.
So how much can AI complement standardization?
Why not? You know, I think if you have, you know, we build your labeling database, right? And if you have, basically the easier case is the classification, right? You already met, you know, the if, you know, we train the system, you already know that, you know, the truth weight corresponds to this, you know, and so on. Classification, that's easy, right? Because you have trained the system. What happens when you don't have that? When you have, you know, the same sentence with a lower key. The code will not, it's not classification anymore. So you need to have other algorithms that help match this naming into the right correlation. This is something that we're doing. So AI is critical here. And machine learning. Machine learning. Okay? Thank you all for attending. I hope you had a good session.